At her sister-in-law's birthday party, hosted in the very house she spent 6 years rebuilding, Camille stood silent as her brother raised a glass and said, "Time for you to move out." What they didn't know, she held the deed in her purse signed and sealed 2 years ago, naming her the sole owner. This isn't just a story about family. It's about how quiet strength can rewrite the ending. Would you have stayed silent or done what Camille did? Drop your thoughts below. There's something oddly cruel about walking into the house you rebuilt only to be labeled a guest. The air was warm, humming with cicadas and the low rhythm of country music crackling through the Bluetooth speakers someone had rigged up on the deck. The lawn looked postcard perfect, freshly trimmed, bordered with folding chairs and crepe paper streamers in pink and gold. Tables groaned under heaping plates of burgers and salads that screamed summer excess. It was the kind of afternoon built for false warmth and tighter smiles. I stepped through the gate with the salad bowl clutched against my chest like a shield. My name was nowhere on the sign by the entrance, no one had asked me to bring anything, and yet I'd spent the morning slicing vegetables grown from soil I'd coaxed back to life. I paused beside the table of name-tagged red Solo cups and scanned until I saw it written in Sharpie slanted and sarcastic Camille, lead volunteer. A laugh. That's what it was meant to be. A harmless joke, maybe even affectionate if you ignored everything that came before. I peeled the tag off slowly and stuck it to my cup anyway. They didn't want me invisible, they wanted me domesticated. Framed. Quiet. Useful. I set the bowl on the table beside a trifle someone else had picked up from the grocery store and turned searching for a chair. Every seat had been claimed. Towel draped here, purse slung there, a paper plate staking territory like a flag. I hovered behind a table, hands folded, watching Tessa sparkle through a crowd of admirers. Her hair was blown out and curled at the ends, dressed crisp like it had been steamed that morning. She laughed loud and often basking. "Are you helping out with the setup?" A man I didn't recognize stood beside me wearing mirrored sunglasses and holding a beer. "Or, do you live here too?" I blinked. But before I could answer, his wife swooped in to drag him toward the dessert table. "She's Grayson's sister, Han. She's the one that takes care of the chickens, I think." The one that takes care of the chickens. I watched their backs disappear into the crowd. Tessa's voice cut through the hum. "Camille, we're short on fruit for the trays. Can you slice the rest of those melons? I think they're still in the mudroom fridge." Her tone was practiced warm enough to avoid scrutiny, firm enough to ensure I moved. I nodded. "Sure." As I stepped inside the house, the shift in temperature wrapped around me. The air smelled like lemon oil and unfamiliar candles. Too clean, too curated. The old creak in the floorboards had been muffled, the photos on the walls rearranged. New frames, fresh smiles, none of them mine. The family portrait that once hung above the mantel Mom and Dad me at 12, Grayson beaming like a god, was gone. I paused at the fridge, resting one hand on the counter. I'd spent the first winter after their accident sleeping here on the worn leather couch in the den, trying to keep the pipes from freezing and answering calls from banks I didn't know we owed. I'd replaced the water heater, painted the trim, cleared the bramble behind the barn. I'd cried once in the kitchen when the freezer broke and ruined a week's worth of meat, and then never again. Back outside, I laid the fruit out in neat rows, my hands sticky with juice, the cutting board stained with watermelon. A child brushed past, nearly toppling the tray, and I steadied it with my hip glancing up just as Tessa gave a performative little wave toward the crowd. Grayson joined her a moment later, a bottle of beer in one hand. He slipped an arm around her waist, pulled her close, and locked eyes with me across the patio. Then he grinned. "Guess it's time you start thinking about moving out, huh?" It was said like a joke, like every word before it. The crowd laughed softly, uncertainly, but no one corrected him. I smiled politely and walked off, but my hand brushed against the envelope inside my purse. Every photo on the wall has a story. Mine was erased. The sun had dipped just far enough to cast a long amber glow across the hardwood floors. The chatter from the backyard filtered through the kitchen windows, clinking glasses, bursts of laughter, the occasional sound of Tessa's voice rising above the rest. I slipped away without a word, taking the long route through the mudroom and into the hallway that led to the front of the house. My house. I paused at the threshold where the hallway met the living room eyes scanning the wall where Mom used to tape up my crayon drawings with scotch tape and grocery store magnets. Now it was lined with professionally framed prints, a curated timeline of a family I barely recognized. There was Grayson at a charity gala, Tessa smiling next to a pumpkin display, their wedding photo printed in sepia tones. Photos of our parents posed informal. A few of extended relatives holding glasses of wine in front of the barn during last year's fall harvest. But not one image of me, not even from childhood. I stepped closer. The arrangement was deliberate, chronological, like a museum exhibit. I remembered standing in this exact spot when I was 10, pointing out my gallery of greats, as I'd called it. I had taped up my spelling test, a picture of our dog Cooper, a stick figure drawing of the whole family. Mom used to pretend it was a real art gallery, charging Dad a ticket to view the wall. Now it was glossy and cold. And I was gone. I ran my fingers lightly along the frame of the most recent photo, Tessa and Grayson in front of the farmhouse porch. My porch. Her dress was the color of champagne, and Grayson's hand rested possessively on her shoulder. The picture had been taken last month during a fundraising barbecue I hadn't been invited to. I had weeded the garden that morning, left through the side gate before the first guest arrived. I kept walking through the hall into the living room where dusk had softened everything. I sat on the edge of the old sofa, reupholstered now, and opened my purse. The envelope inside was worn at the edges, the paper folded so many times the crease was starting to split. I ran a thumb along it before pulling it out and unfolding the contents with slow precision. There it was. My name, etched on the deed in black ink, notarized, dated May 4th, 2021. The supplemental will from our mother sent to me after her diagnosis, signed in the presence of her attorney and a county official. Her final decision quiet and sure. She had written in the accompanying letter, "You're the only one who'll protect what we built. Your brother loves ambition more than land." I had kept it to myself, thinking that eventually, when grief settled and wounds weren't so fresh, we'd find our way back to each other. That fairness would rise naturally like good soil after a rain. Instead, they took over. Grayson and Tessa moved in within 2 weeks of the funeral. I stayed on quietly because someone had to keep the place breathing. Bills needed paying, chickens needed feeding, but they never asked. They simply assumed. "Still got it, don't you?" The voice came like a breeze, soft close. I looked up to see Aunt Maggie standing beside the mantel wine glass in hand, eyes fixed on the collage of photos behind me. She didn't say more, just gave a small knowing nod before moving on her cane, tapping gently as she walked toward the front porch. She'd always been the one who saw through things. When others offered casseroles and hollow condolences, she gave me tools, gloves, and a box of leftover seeds. No questions. No pity. Just presence. I looked back down at the documents in my lap, then at the keys I hadn't realized I'd pulled from my bag. The metal was warm from the press of my palm. I turned them over slowly. The tag Mom had handwritten still dangled from one ring main house. Camille. My thumb traced the lettering. It was fading but still visible. Still mine. The hallway creaked and I looked up to see Tessa standing in the doorway with a half-filled glass of rosé in her hand. She smiled like she hadn't just walked into the private moment I didn't know I needed. "We'll need you to help clear out the guest room next week. Investors are touring." They toasted to a family milestone. I waited. One more lie and the truth would come out. The string lights blinked to life as the last ribbons of sunlight slipped behind the tree line. Everything glowed soft amber bulbs overhead, pink frosting under glass domes, sequins on Tessa's dress catching every shimmer like a net cast for attention. The fire pit had been lit. The music was gentler now, playing something acoustic and inoffensive. People gathered near the dessert table, murmuring, smiling too wide, wine-drunk and satisfied. Tessa stood at the center of the crowd, elevated just enough on a flat stone by the garden to give her a full view. She raised her glass rosé, catching the lights like blush, and waited. The chatter fell quiet with a few shushes, one let the lady speak. She tilted her head, beaming. "First of all, thank you all for coming to celebrate with us today. This place, this land, has seen generations of hearts build a life from the ground up. It's more than just a home. It's a legacy." Soft claps echoed. Tessa glanced at Grayson, then back at the group. And we're excited to finally share what's next. Hart Farm is officially transitioning into a full-service wedding venue. Outdoor ceremonies, barn receptions, full coordination packages, we've already lined up interest. Applause broke out louder now. Someone called out, "Does Camille get the barn as a dressing room?" Laughter followed, too many heads turning in my direction at once. I smiled, small, controlled. I didn't step forward. Not yet. You've all been part of this journey with us. Tessa continued riding the wave of attention, and we can't wait to build this dream together. She raised her glass. To the future of Hart Farm. To Hart Farm, the crowd echoed. I waited for the clinking of glasses to settle, for the applause to taper into ambient chatter. Then I stepped forward, not loudly, not hurried, just enough to reach the center of the gathering. My heels clicked against the flagstone with precision like punctuation. I didn't look at Tessa or Grayson. I didn't look at anyone, not even Aunt Maggie, though I felt her watching. My hand reached into my purse. The envelope slid out effortlessly, the paper now soft from handling corners, curled with intent. "I'd like to say something," I said. Silence. The sort that falls not because you've commanded it, but because the air itself has shifted. Tessa's mouth held its smile, but her eyes sharpened. "Before we cut the cake," I said, "I have a small correction to make." I held up the envelope not above my head. Not dramatic, just enough that anyone in front of me could see. Then I opened it and unfolded the papers slowly, letting the rustle fill the stillness. "This land is mine," I said, voice steady. "Has been for 2 years. A beat passed. Then another. What someone whispered. Signed and notarized in May 2021. I continued, keeping my voice measured. "It was our mother's wish. She updated the deed herself. I've kept it quiet out of respect. But I see now that silence only ever benefits the loud." Gasps rippled. Aunt Maggie tilted her head, giving the faintest nod. Grayson didn't move. His jaw was set, a tick working behind his temple. Tessa's smile held for 2 seconds longer before it slipped just enough to expose the tight lines around her mouth. I turned slightly, making sure my words weren't rushed, my posture unyielding. No venue planning, no investors, no transition. My tone didn't rise. "You've both built your dreams on borrowed ground." More whispers now, one guest shifting awkwardly, another tugging their spouse's sleeve. "And one more thing," I added. "You have 30 days to vacate." The words dropped like stone into water, slow and heavy. "I'll be changing the locks in the morning." Nobody reached for cake after my announcement. Even the candles seemed to burn quieter. A hush spread across the backyard like a spilled glass of wine soaking into every corner. The flickering lights strung overhead didn't twinkle anymore. They just hung suspended as if afraid to move. I stood in the center of it all, documents still in hand, while the others hovered in a stunned tableau. Grayson blinked first. He laughed, a short, choked sound that didn't land. "This is a prank, right?" he said, his voice pushing into a chuckle that bordered on panic. "Come on, Camille. You've always had a flair for drama." He looked around for backup, but the guests weren't laughing. A few exchanged uncertain glances, one woman even backing away slightly with her drink still halfway to her lips. Tessa stepped forward, heels clicking with purpose. "This is some elaborate stunt," she said, eyeing the papers like they were kindling. "You couldn't possibly think I didn't raise my voice." I just tapped the screen of my phone and said, "Emailing copies now." The screen glowed softly as I opened the group contact for Hart Farm BBQ. Yes, the same one they used to organize everything without me, and hit send. "Inbox," I added. "Check yours." Grayson's phone chimed a second later. Then another ping. And another. The silence was broken only by the sounds of devices catching up. "She's bluffing," Tessa muttered. "She's not." Aunt Maggie's voice cut in steady and cool. Every head turned. She stepped forward with the help of her cane shoulders squared despite her slight frame. "I was there when my sister signed it," she said. "I witnessed it myself. Lucid, sharp as ever. She knew exactly what she was doing." Tessa's mouth opened, then snapped shut. For once, no perfectly spun rebuttal surfaced. "What this is? She hissed instead is betrayal. I let her words settle for a breath before anyone else could rush to fill the space. From the back of the crowd, Eric finally moved. He had been silent all evening, leaning against the fence post like a shadow. Now his voice rang out clear and sharp. What's betrayal, he said, is erasing the one who kept this place alive? I turned surprised, but only for a moment. He looked directly at Grayson, then at Tessa. There was no anger in his face, only truth. You turned her into a ghost in her own home, he continued. And you thought no one would notice. Tension cracked through the group like dry ice. A woman stepped away from the buffet. Someone set down a wine glass too hard. Grayson opened his mouth again, but I was already speaking. You toasted to the future, I said, lifting my gaze to the whole crowd. I just ensured it has roots. A ripple passed over them, not applause, not resistance, just something like release. The kind that comes after a long-held breath. Then Tessa lunged. She snatched the documents from my hand with a sharp tug, her face twisted with something feral. Her fingers crumpled the edge of the notarized page before I even blinked. But I didn't flinch. Copies are with my lawyer, Tessa, I said calmly, locking my phone and sliding it into my pocket. You're only shredding your reputation now. No screaming, no slamming doors. Just the quiet weight of their defeat settling like ash after a burned-out bonfire. The yard had mostly emptied. Plates stacked on folding tables, forgotten desserts sweating under plastic wrap candles, burned down to wax puddles. The silence wasn't total crickets thrummed in the grass, and the fairy lights overhead still flickered with residual cheer, but everything else had dimmed, drawn in on itself. I stood on the back porch with a folder in my hand. Tessa and Grayson were halfway down the steps when I called out my voice level. One more thing before you leave. They turned. Tessa crossed her arms. Grayson just looked tired. I walked over and held out 2 envelopes. 30-day notice to vacate. Signed, notarized, and filed with the county. Tessa didn't take it. Grayson did. You're really going through with this? She said, voice low but biting. This house, this farm, it was always about family. And now you've torn it apart. I looked at her. Really looked at the fury, just masking a deeper fear at the elegance suddenly weighed down by the fact that charm couldn't reverse legality. Family didn't break today, I said. It broke when you decided only power mattered. Tessa scoffed and stepped back, the papers still untouched in her husband's hand. Grayson lingered. His fingers tightened around the envelope, then relaxed. He didn't look at me when he spoke. Mom always believed in you. He said, almost a whisper. I just didn't want to be second. I didn't respond with comfort. I didn't correct him. There wasn't anything left to fix. I gave a small nod, enough to acknowledge what he'd said, but nothing more. They walked away. Steps crunching on gravel. No drama. No final word. Just fading footsteps and the hum of regret settling in. I stood for a while, letting the night settle. The lights above buzzed softly, tired like the rest of us. Aunt Maggie sat by the porch rail, sipping tea from a chipped mug. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. Just gave me a slow, proud nod before heading inside. I walked to the side gate, the one that creaked in cold weather, and pulled out the spare key from my back pocket. The old lock clicked free with a soft snap. I replaced it with a new one. No grand gesture, no audience. Just a clean break. Closure with a metal finish. Behind me, the rustling of plastic and clatter of plates signaled someone else still here. Eric stood by the table, gathering what little trash hadn't already blown into the hedges. He leaned on the broom, watching me as I walked back up. You sure know how to throw a party? He said. I smirked. He swept a few apple slices into a compost bin, then paused. So, ever think about hosting a harvest dinner again? He asked. The right kind of people this time? The morning after the silence was different. Not empty, just mine. The air was cool, the kind that settles before the sun decides to burn it off. I stood on the porch barefoot, a mug of coffee warming my hands. The boards beneath me were weathered but firm, like the house itself held together by grit, not polish. Birds rustled in the nearby fig trees, cautious but curious, as if testing the shift in ownership too. Everything felt still, not paused, settled. I stepped down and crossed the yard slowly. My footprints pressed into dew-kissed grass. The garden, overgrown in places, smelled of mint and loam. Lavender from the west edge brushed against my knee. No artificial fanfare, just quiet reclamation. The gate stood slightly ajar, the same one Grayson and I used to swing open for deliveries, the one Dad repainted every summer. At the top, the old sign hung faithfully, Hart Family Farm, Est 1949. I stared at it for a while. Not in resentment, not anymore. Then I took a smaller plank of wood from the porch, the one I carved myself months ago when I first started dreaming in concrete instead of maybes. I hooked it neatly beneath the original sign, Stewarded by Camille Hart, 2021. Aunt Maggie passed behind me on her morning walk, a scarf tied around her curls and a thermos swinging gently at her side. She gave a soft, satisfied nod without breaking pace. No need for words. Back inside the kitchen smelled of brewed coffee and lemon oil. Someone had cleaned the counters, Eric probably. I picked up my mug again and noticed a folded note tucked underneath. The handwriting was jagged, like it had been rewritten too many times. You did what I couldn't. Maybe that's what Mom saw. Grayson. No apology, but honesty maybe for the first time. I placed it in the drawer near the stove, not to save it, not to display it, just to make space for it to exist. Later, I went upstairs. My room, the one they used as a storage space for 3 years, still smelled faintly of lavender sachets I'd left behind in a drawer. Sunlight spilled across the old quilt, and the window creaked open with familiar resistance. I leaned out. The fields stretched toward the horizon, golden and quiet. They didn't feel haunted anymore. I didn't know how long I stood there before I heard the gravel crunch. Eric again. He walked toward the porch with something in hand, a small jar golden and glinting in the light. Brought honey, he said, lifting it slightly. Also, I know someone who might want to rent the barn for writing retreats, if you're open. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was earned. The ones who mocked her as a guest were now just memories fading in the dust she no longer had to clean up after. Justice didn't arrive with noise or fury, but with the unshakable weight of proof and persistence. When injustice is met with quiet conviction, even the loudest liars fall silent. Not all revolutions need a microphone. Some begin with a locked gate and a name carved in wood.